My daughter-in-law slapped me at the altar on their wedding day. I'd just stepped forward to fix her veil, a delicate piece of lace I helped pay for. I whispered kindly, reached up gently, and her hand cracked across my cheek like a whip. In front of 200 guests, my hand flew to my face. I looked at my son, my only child, for help, for anything. But Michael just stood there, still holding hers, eyes blank, like I was no one. I waited, through the vows, through the reception, through being seated at a table near the back like an afterthought. I waited for an apology that never came. That slap didn't just bruise my cheek, it broke something inside me. They didn't know that 6 months before, I had quietly co-signed their mortgage. They didn't know I could quietly unsign it too. No yelling, no drama, just a ticking clock. And trust me, sweetheart, when it strikes 0, the house they love so much, they'll wish they'd remembered who paid for it. But before we begin, dear, comment under this video where in the world you're watching from today. Now let's start from the beginning. I never thought my son's wedding day would end with my face stinging and my heart in pieces. But then, I never thought a lot of things about Michael would turn out the way they did. The church had looked beautiful that morning, all white roses and satin ribbons trailing down the pews. I'd helped pay for those flowers, of course, just like I'd helped pay for the reception hall, the photographer, and that enormous cake with the little figurines on top. What's a mother for, if not to help her only child have the wedding of his dreams? Or rather, the wedding of Vanessa's dreams. My soon-to-be daughter-in-law had very specific dreams. "Mom, you're fussing again," Michael had said, when I arrived at the church early to make sure everything was perfect. He'd looked so handsome in his tuxedo, my boy. His father would have been proud to see him standing tall like that, though Harold had been gone nearly 20 years now. "I'm allowed to fuss," I'd told him, straightening his boutonniere. "It's what mothers do on wedding days." The ceremony itself had proceeded exactly as rehearsed. The bridesmaids in their lavender dresses, the groomsmen with their matching ties, the flower girl, Vanessa's niece, scattering rose petals with determined concentration. And then Vanessa, floating down the aisle in a dress that cost more than my first car. I dabbed at my eyes, feeling that complicated mixture of joy and loss that I suppose all mothers feel watching their children marry. My Michael, all grown up, starting his own family now. It was during the final moments at the altar that everything changed. The minister had just pronounced them husband and wife, but before they turned to face the congregation, I noticed Vanessa's veil had caught on her earring. A small thing, the kind of detail a mother notices. I stepped forward, just 2 steps from my front row seat. "Your veil, dear," I whispered, reaching up to gently untangle the delicate lace from her diamond earring. "There, that's..." The crack of her palm against my cheek echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the church. The sound seemed to hang there, suspended in the sudden silence. My hand flew to my face, more from shock than pain, though the pain came quickly enough. A burning handprint on my 70-year-old skin. "Don't touch me," Vanessa hissed, her voice low but perfectly audible in the shocked quiet. I looked at Michael, waiting for something, anything, his intervention, his surprise, his apology on her behalf. But my son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died, just stared blankly ahead. His fingers still intertwined with hers, his face a mask I couldn't read. The moment stretched like taffy, painful and thin. Then the organist, bless her quick thinking, began playing, and the spell broke. The newlyweds turned and walked down the aisle, smiling as if nothing had happened. I sat back down, my legs suddenly too weak to hold me. Martha, my oldest friend, squeezed my hand. "Did that just happen?" she whispered. I couldn't answer. My cheek throbbed in time with my heartbeat. The reception was worse, in its way. The slap had been shocking, public, undeniable. But what followed was a slow, deliberate erasure. I sat at my designated table, not the family table I noticed, but one near the back with distant cousins and Michael's former piano teacher. Vanessa's family occupied the places of honor, clustered around the bride and groom like a protective wall. "Ladies and gentlemen," the DJ announced, "please welcome for the first time Mr. and Mrs. Michael Harmon." Vanessa beamed, clutching Michael's arm. "That's me," she squealed loudly enough for half the room to hear. "I'm Mrs. Harmon now. I have a new family." Her eyes found mine across the room as she said it, not by accident, I was certain. I waited through the first dance, the toasts, I had not been asked to give one, and the cutting of the cake. I kept expecting Michael to come check on me, to whisper an explanation or an apology. He didn't. When the dancing began in earnest, I gathered my small beaded purse and my wrap. "You're not leaving already?" Martha asked, concern etching deeper lines around her eyes. "I have a headache," I said. It wasn't a lie exactly. I slipped out without saying goodbye. Neither the bride nor groom noticed. The drive home was a blur. My house, the same one where I'd raised Michael, where he'd taken his first steps and lost his first tooth, felt cavernous and cold when I let myself in. I didn't turn on the lights, just sat in my armchair in the dark, my wedding finery pooling around me like spilled ink. The slap kept replaying in my mind. The sound of it, the shock, the way no one, not even my son, had defended me. My fingers found the drawer of the side table, pulling it open by memory. Inside was the checkbook I'd used 6 months earlier, when Michael and Vanessa had come to me, desperate and hopeful. "It's our dream home, Mom," Michael had said, "but we need a cosigner for the mortgage, just until my promotion comes through." I'd signed without hesitation. What's a mother for, if not to help? Now, sitting in the dark, I wondered if today's slap had been more than a bride's nerves or temper. It felt calculated. A message. I was no longer needed. My usefulness, financial and otherwise, had reached its end. "I'm Mrs. Harmon now. I have a new family." I touched my cheek again, the sting finally fading. But the wound beneath it, the one in my heart where my son's loyalty should have been, that one was just beginning to bleed. I spent the next morning in my garden, methodically pulling weeds while my mind kept returning to that slap. With dirt under my fingernails and sweat on my brow, I finally allowed myself to remember the months leading up to the wedding, when everything had seemed so different. It was early spring when Michael and Vanessa had first come to me about the house. They'd arrived for Sunday dinner, both practically vibrating with excitement. "We found it, Mom," Michael had said, spreading photos across my kitchen table. "Our forever home." I remember how his eyes had lit up as he showed me each picture: the spacious kitchen with granite countertops, the backyard perfect for future grandchildren, the master bedroom with a view of the mountains. Vanessa had stood beside him, her hand possessively on his shoulder, nodding along. "There's just one small issue," she'd said, her voice honeyed in a way I now recognized as calculation. "The bank needs a co-signer, just temporarily." Michael had jumped in quickly. "My promotion is basically guaranteed, Mom. It's just a formality until then. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I'd felt so proud to help them, so needed. What mother doesn't want to give her children roots, foundations, futures? I signed the papers without hesitation, my name alongside theirs on a 30-year commitment. Back then, Michael had called me every week, sometimes just to chat, other times to ask about recipes or gardening tips for their new yard. I'd felt included in their life building, important. Now, 3 days after the wedding, my phone remained silent. The bruise on my cheek had faded to a yellowish smudge, but the wound beneath it festered. I considered confronting him, rehearsed the conversation in my head. Michael, why didn't you say anything when she hit me? Why have you allowed this distance between us? But what would that accomplish? Would it bring back the son who once called me every week? Or would it push him further into Vanessa's orbit? So I did what mothers have done since time began. I waited. I swallowed my hurt. I showed up. The following Sunday, I brought a potted orchid to their brunch invitation, a peace offering, though I wasn't the one who needed to make peace. How lovely, Vanessa said when I handed it to her, setting it aside without another glance. She barely looked at me throughout the meal, directing her conversation to the other guests, her parents, her college roommate, her cousin. I sat at the far end of the table, sipping mimosas that couldn't dull the ache in my chest. Michael caught my eye once or twice, offering tight smiles that never reached his eyes. These brunches became a pattern over the next few weeks, each one more painful than the last. I'd arrive with small gifts, homemade jam, fresh flowers from my garden, books I thought they might enjoy. Vanessa would accept them with mechanical thanks before turning away. My heart tightened each time I stepped through their front door. This house that I had helped them buy, my name, hidden behind every foundation brick, every mortgage payment, my contribution, invisible but essential. Still, I kept quiet. Was I overreacting? Was a single slap on a stressful day worth this growing unease? Or would speaking up only drive Michael further away? "You seem distracted," Martha said to me one day over coffee. "Is it still about what happened at the wedding?" "Partly," I admitted, "but it's more than that. It's like I've lost him, like he's become someone I don't recognize." "Have you talked to him about it?" I shook my head. I'm afraid of making it worse. 4 weeks after the wedding, I arrived for another Sunday brunch. This time, it was just the three of us, no buffer of additional guests to ease the tension. Vanessa spent most of the meal on her phone, occasionally showing Michael something that made them both laugh, private jokes I wasn't invited to share. The conversation, what little there was, felt strained and artificial. When the check came, they both stood up. "We need to run," Vanessa said, gathering her purse. "I completely forgot we promised to meet the Hendersons at the farmer's market." Michael leaned down and kissed my cheek, the first real affection he'd shown me in weeks. "Thanks again for everything, Mom," he whispered. I nodded, watching them leave, the check sitting untouched on the table. Another small slight, another reminder of my new place in their lives. As I reached for my wallet, a thought suddenly struck me. I hadn't seen a mortgage receipt in months, not since before the wedding. The bank had been sending me notices as a co-signer, but I'd been automatically forwarding them to Michael's email, trusting him to handle the payments as promised. Now, sitting alone with a brunch bill I hadn't expected to pay, I wondered what else I'd been blind to. "Thanks again for everything, Mom." The words echoed differently now. less like gratitude, more like acknowledgement of a debt that would never be repaid. I went home that afternoon with a heaviness in my chest that felt like wet cement hardening around my heart. The house was too quiet, my thoughts too loud. I sat at my kitchen table, the place where I'd taught Michael to write his name, where I'd helped him with algebra homework, where I'd signed the co-signer papers for his mortgage with pride swelling in my chest. I pulled out my laptop, the one Michael had set up for me 3 Christmases ago, and logged into my bank account. The interface was still confusing to me, but I'd learned enough to check my statements. My fingers trembled slightly as I clicked through to July's statement. There it was, a withdrawal of $2,347.82 to Coastal Mortgage Company. I frowned. I didn't remember making that payment. I checked June's statement, nothing unusual there. But July? The mortgage payment had come from my account. I scrolled to August's statement, another $2,347.82 to Coastal Mortgage. September 2, my retirement fund, the careful nest egg I'd built over 40 years of teaching, was being drained month by month. This can't be right, I whispered to the empty kitchen. But the numbers didn't lie. I picked up my phone to call Michael, then set it down again. What would I say? That I'd discovered he wasn't making the payments he'd promised to make? That I felt used? Number I needed to be sure first. I made myself a cup of tea and tried to think rationally. Maybe there was a mix-up with the automatic payments. Maybe Michael didn't even realize what was happening. So I paid October's mortgage too, when it came due. I said nothing, believing they would catch up, that Michael would notice and make things right. But my phone only rang when he needed something. Mom, can you watch the house while we're in Cabo next weekend? Mom, do you still have Dad's old toolbox? The sink is leaking. Mom, can you pick up our dry cleaning? Vanessa's swamped at work. Each request felt less like a son reaching out and more like someone checking to make sure their ATM card still worked. By mid-October, the fear I'd been pushing down rose to the surface. I had been reduced to a walking checkbook. The thought made me sick. I tried to dismiss it. Mothers help their children. That's what we do. But Harold's voice echoed in my mind. There's a difference between helping and enabling, Margaret. On a chilly October afternoon with leaves skittering across my driveway like nervous creatures, Michael stopped by to borrow my ladder. I made him coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, that same table where so many important conversations had happened. Is everything all right? I asked, gently watching his face. With the house, I mean, the finances. He laughed, stirring sugar into his coffee. Why wouldn't it be? I hesitated. I noticed the mortgage payments are coming from my account. Something flickered across his face. Surprise? Guilt? It was gone too quickly to tell. Oh, that, he said, waving his hand dismissively. Just a temporary thing. Vanessa's job had some commission delays. I see. I wrapped my hands around my mug, drawing warmth from it. When do you think you'll be able to take over the payments again? He shrugged, not meeting my eyes. Soon. But you'll keep paying, right? Just until things settle down? That moment landed like a stone in my stomach. Not an apology, not a thank you, not even acknowledgement of the burden, just an expectation that I would continue to drain my retirement to fund their lifestyle. Something inside me snapped, not loudly, not dramatically. It was a quiet breaking, like a thread that had been stretched too far for too long. Of course, I heard myself say, I'll take care of it. After he left with the ladder, I sat motionless at the table for a long time. Then I changed into my good blue dress, the one I wore to parent-teacher conferences when I needed to project authority, and drove to the bank. Mr. Peterson, who had handled my account since Harold died, looked concerned when I explained the situation. "Mrs. Lawson, I'm sorry to hear this. There are several options we can discuss." We talked for over an hour about mortgage obligations, about cosigner rights, about financial protection. In the end, I made my decision. I would make the payments for exactly 60 more days. After that, the automatic withdrawals would stop. The bank would send the standard notices. If Michael and Vanessa didn't respond, foreclosure proceedings would begin. "Are you sure about this?" Mr. Peterson asked. "It could affect your relationship with your son." I thought about the slap at the altar, about the silent brunches, about "thanks again for everything, Mom," while leaving me with the check. "I'm sure," I said quietly. As I walked out of the bank into the crisp autumn air, I realized the clock had started ticking. 60 days. What would they do when the money dried up? Would they finally see me as more than a financial safety net? I didn't know. But for the first time since the wedding, I felt something other than hurt and confusion. I felt a calm certainty. This was necessary, not just for my financial security, but for whatever relationship might still be salvaged with my son. The countdown had begun. I marked the days on my kitchen calendar with small red dots. 58 days left. 43. 31. Each morning I'd sip my tea and look at that calendar, wondering what would happen when we reached 0. Michael called twice during November, once to ask if I could water their plants while they went to a weekend wedding in Vermont, and once to see if I'd host Thanksgiving. I agreed to both, keeping my voice light and interested. I asked about the house, about their jobs. He gave vague, cheerful answers that told me nothing. "Everything's great, Mom. Couldn't be better." I started saving everything. Every text message asking for a little help. Every voicemail. I printed bank statements and highlighted the mortgage payments. I wasn't sure what I was preparing for, but something told me I needed proof. When Thanksgiving arrived, I roasted a turkey and made all the traditional sides. Michael and Vanessa showed up an hour late. "Sorry," Vanessa said, not sounding sorry at all. "The traffic was terrible." She barely looked at me as she swept into my living room, her designer boots clicking on the hardwood floors. Michael followed behind, carrying a store-bought pie. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Smells great in here." Throughout dinner, Vanessa dominated the conversation. She talked about their new curtains, custom-made, of course, her weekly spa days, absolute necessity for stress management, and the Peloton bike they'd just purchased. Michael's Christmas gift, but I use it more. "The house is really coming together," she said, reaching for another helping of sweet potatoes. "We're thinking of redoing the master bath next. Marble everything." I nodded and smiled, passing the gravy. 27 days left on my calendar. "How are things at the office?" I asked Michael, trying to gauge their financial situation. "Busy," he said vaguely. "End of year is always crazy." Vanessa jumped in. "He's definitely due for a raise. His boss is completely taking advantage of him." After they left, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and leftovers, wondering if they had any idea what was coming. Or maybe they did know. Maybe they were spending recklessly because they assumed I would always be there to catch them. 2 weeks later, my credit card bill arrived. I always paid it in full each month. Harold had been adamant about avoiding interest charges. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table and began reviewing the charges. Gas station, grocery store, pharmacy, all normal. Then I saw it. Serenity Day Spa and Wellness Center, $879. My hands trembled as I held the paper. I had never been to this spa. I certainly hadn't spent nearly $900 there. I called the credit card company immediately. "Yes, Mrs. Lawson," the representative said after looking up the charge. "That payment was processed using your card information on December 3rd. It appears to be for a couple's massage package, hot stone therapy, and facial treatments." A couple's package. My stomach tightened. "I didn't authorize this charge," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'll flag it as potentially fraudulent and send you a form to complete. In the meantime, would you like us to issue a new card?" "Yes," I said, "please." After hanging up, I pulled out my files. Something wasn't right. If they were using my credit card without permission, what else were they doing? I spent the next day combing through every statement, every receipt, every financial document from the past year. What I found made me physically ill. A furniture store charge from August, $3,200, an electronics store in September, $2,100, 3 restaurant charges over $200 each, all on cards I rarely used, all unauthorized. The debt was stacking up under my name while they lived their lavish life in the house I was paying for. I sat back in my chair, exhausted and shaking. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it took my breath away. This wasn't just entitlement or carelessness. This was deliberate. And suddenly, like a film replaying in high definition, I saw the wedding day again. Vanessa's face as she approached me at the altar, the calm, almost mechanical way she had raised her hand, the deliberate force of the slap, the lack of emotion afterward. That wasn't an impulsive act of bridezilla nerves. That was purposeful, rehearsed, a statement, and Michael's blank stare. Not shock, not confusion, just nothing. As if he had expected it, as if he had known it was coming. "They planned this," I whispered to my empty kitchen. The words hung in the air, terrible and true. This wasn't a series of bad decisions or financial irresponsibility. This was a scheme. A long con with me as the target. But why? What was the end game? And who else might be involved? The questions swirled in my mind as I gathered the evidence of their betrayal into a folder. 13 days left on my calendar. Whatever was coming, I needed to be ready. I spent Thanksgiving morning baking pumpkin pies, the same recipe I'd used for 40 years. The familiar routine steadied my hands, but my mind kept circling back to the folder of evidence hidden in my desk drawer. 12 days left on my calendar. My son and daughter-in-law had declined my invitation this year. "We're doing Friendsgiving," Michael had texted. The message arrived without a call, without the courtesy of hearing my voice. I read between the lines. I wasn't worth the effort anymore. Instead, I'd invited a few friends from my teaching days, widows and divorcees like me, women who understood loss and rebuilding. Among them was Irene, my closest friend since we'd taught 3rd grade together decades ago. Irene arrived first, silver bob perfectly styled, carrying homemade cranberry sauce and a bottle of good Merlot. "You look tired," she said, hanging her coat in the hallway. No pleasantries, no sugar-coating. That was Irene, direct as a ruler's edge. "I haven't been sleeping well," I admitted. She studied my face. This isn't just empty nest syndrome, is it? I shook my head but said nothing more as the doorbell rang again. Soon my dining room filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. For a few hours I let myself be carried away by stories and memories, grateful for these women who had weathered life's storms alongside me. After dinner, while the others chatted over coffee in the living room, Irene cornered me in the kitchen. She topped off both our wine glasses and leaned against the counter. "All right, out with it," she said. "Something's eating at you, and I'm guessing it has to do with that son of yours and his charming bride." My hand stilled over the dishes I was rinsing. "What makes you say that?" "Because you haven't mentioned them once today. Because you flinched when Carol asked about their new house. Because I've known you for 30 years and you're carrying something heavy." The dam broke. Words poured out. The slap at the wedding, the mortgage I was secretly paying, the unauthorized credit card charges, the calendar counting down to foreclosure. Irene listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing as I reached the end. "There's something else you should know," she said finally, setting down her wine glass. "Something I've been debating whether to tell you." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Vanessa's cousin, Melissa Crawford. She works at Fairview Mortgage." I stared at her blankly. "The firm that holds their mortgage?" Irene nodded. "The same. I ran into her at the supermarket last month. She was smug. Asked how you were doing, if you were still helping the kids. Something in her tone made my skin crawl." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "You think she knew about the co-signing?" "I think she did more than know. I think she facilitated it." Irene reached for my hand. "Think about it. Vanessa's cousin works at the mortgage company. They knew exactly what they were doing when they asked you to co-sign. They knew you'd be liable. They probably knew your credit score was better than theirs." "But why the slap?" I whispered. "Why humiliate me like that?" "To establish dominance, to show you your place, to make sure you'd be too embarrassed to speak up when things started going wrong." Irene's voice hardened. "It wasn't carelessness, Eleanor. It was strategy." Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. The slap, Michael's silence, the mortgage timing, the gradual distancing, the financial abuse. It wasn't a series of mistakes or entitlement gone wild. It was calculated exploitation. I felt the sting of betrayal all over again, sharper now with this new understanding. My hands began to shake. "I need to confront them," I said, reaching for my phone. "Right now." Irene caught my wrist. "Number? Not yet." "But they've been using me. They've been laughing behind my back." "And they'll keep laughing if you confront them emotionally," she said firmly. "You need to be strategic just like they were. Let your plan play out. Let the foreclosure happen. Let it land when it hurts them most." I took a deep, shuddering breath. I just can't believe my own son would do this. "People surprise us," Irene said softly, "not always in good ways." After everyone left, I sat alone in my darkened living room, nursing the last of the wine. The house felt too quiet, too empty with the weight of what I now knew. I opened my laptop and navigated to my banking portal. The next mortgage payment was scheduled for the 1st of the month, just 7 days away. My finger hovered over the cancel payment button. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to let my son and his wife face foreclosure? Harold's voice seemed to whisper in my ear. "They made their choice, Ellie. Now you make yours." I clicked cancel payment. A confirmation window appeared, asking if I was sure. I thought of the slap, of the spa charges, of Melissa at the mortgage company, of all the calculated moves they'd made to use me. I clicked confirm. Then I went further, canceling all future automatic payments to that account. Each click felt like cutting a string that had been binding me. When I finally closed the laptop, something had shifted inside me. The game had changed. They thought I was a pawn, but they'd forgotten who taught my son to play chess in the first place. I picked up my phone and texted Irene, "It's done." 2 weeks passed with a strange, buzzing quiet. I kept my routine, watering plants, reading mysteries, meeting Irene for coffee. But underneath, I felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the storm I'd set in motion. The foreclosure notices would have arrived by now. I pictured them, crisp white envelopes with their official red stamps. Warning, notice, final demand. I imagined them sitting on the kitchen counter in that beautiful house I'd helped them buy, their edges sharp as the truth they contained. Still, I said nothing. When Michael texted to invite me for Sunday brunch, I replied with a simple, "Looking forward to it," as if nothing had changed. That Sunday morning, I drove to their house with a basket of muffins and a heart full of resolve. The lawn, usually manicured to perfection, had grown slightly shaggy around the edges. A small detail, but I noticed. Vanessa opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, her voice tight, "come in." The house felt different, tense. The expensive candles weren't lit. The music wasn't playing. And Michael, my son, looked exhausted, with shadows under his eyes I hadn't seen since his college finals. "Mom," he said, kissing my cheek. His hands trembled slightly. "Thanks for coming." Throughout brunch, I watched them like a naturalist observing animals in the wild. They barely spoke to each other. Michael checked his phone constantly. Vanessa dropped a fork and nearly burst into tears. Neither mentioned money, mortgages, or banks. Neither met my eyes for more than a second. "Is everything all right?" I asked innocently, spreading jam on my toast. "You both seem distracted." "Fine," Michael said too quickly. "Just busy with work." Vanessa nodded vigorously. "So busy. You know how it is." I did know. I knew exactly how it was to carry a burden alone, to smile through pain, to pretend everything was fine when your world was crumbling. The meal ended early. No lingering over coffee, no suggestions of shopping afterward. They practically rushed me out, making vague promises about doing this again soon. As I drove home, I felt a complex mixture of emotions, sadness for what was breaking, but also a steely satisfaction. They didn't know I knew. They didn't know I was the architect of their current crisis. They were still trying to maintain the facade, not realizing the stage beneath them had already collapsed. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was deadheading roses in the garden. Michael's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "Mom!" His voice exploded through the speaker, panic and rage twisting his usually controlled tone. "What the hell is going on? The bank. They're saying we've missed payments. They're saying we're in foreclosure." I set down my garden shears and sat on the bench Harold had built decades ago. "Are they?" I asked calmly. "Yes. There are letters, certified letters. They're saying the last payment was 2 months ago and—" He stopped abruptly. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. "Mom," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What did you do?" "I stopped paying," I replied simply. The silence stretched between us, vast as an ocean. You, what? He finally managed. I stopped paying the mortgage on your house. My voice remained steady, though my heart hammered against my ribs. It's your home, Michael. Handle it. You can't just, he sputtered. You co-signed. You're legally responsible. Yes, I am. And I've been fulfilling that responsibility for months while you and Vanessa spent money on spas and Pelotons. The words flowed easier now. I've paid nearly $20,000 on your mortgage since the wedding, money you never intended to repay. That's not— It is true, I cut him off. I have the bank statements. I have the records. I even have the receipt for Vanessa's spa day that somehow ended up on my credit card. His breathing was ragged on the other end of the line. Mom, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I understand that you and Vanessa and her cousin at the mortgage company thought you could use me, that you could slap me in public and I'd be too embarrassed to speak up, that you could drain my retirement fund and I'd be too loving to notice. This is crazy, he hissed. You're betraying your own family. The word hit me like a physical blow. Betrayal. Coming from him, it sounded obscene. No, Michael, I said quietly. You betrayed me. The moment you stood silent while your wife slapped me at the altar, the moment you decided my purpose was to fund your lifestyle, the moment you chose to use me instead of love me. Mom dash. I've made my decision, I said, my voice finally breaking. The payments have stopped. What happens next is up to you. You'll regret this, he threatened, his voice thick with tears or rage. I couldn't tell which. When this blows up, when we lose everything, you'll regret it. I thought about regret, about all the nights I'd lain awake wondering where I'd gone wrong, about the shame I'd carried since the wedding, about the financial burden I'd shouldered in silence. No, I said with sudden clarity. I don't think I will. I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking. Tears streamed down my face, but alongside the grief was something unexpected. Relief. A weight had lifted. For the first time in months, I wasn't being used. I wasn't pretending. I wasn't enabling their exploitation. I sat in my garden, surrounded by the roses Harold and I had planted together, and I breathed deeply. The air tasted different somehow, cleaner, freer. I didn't see Michael or Vanessa after that phone call, not in person anyway. I heard about them, of course. Our small town has always had a robust grapevine. Word travels faster than light when scandal is involved. Winter melted into spring, and I watched their downfall from a distance, like viewing a shipwreck from the safety of shore. I didn't take pleasure in it. How could I? This was my son's life capsizing, but I couldn't save someone determined to drown me in the process. The foreclosure proceedings moved swiftly. By March, the bank had repossessed the house, that beautiful Tudor with the bay windows and the garden I'd helped plant last summer. I drove past it once, just once, and saw the auction sign staked in the front lawn. My name had been on that mortgage too, but I'd worked with the bank to limit the damage to my own credit. It had cost me, both financially and emotionally, but I'd managed to protect myself. Michael and Vanessa couldn't say the same. Their credit was in ruins. I heard they'd moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place Michael would have once deemed beneath him. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing with doubt. Had I gone too far? Was I a terrible mother? But then I'd remember the slap, the theft, the calculated exploitation, and I knew I'd simply stopped being a willing victim. They tried to control the narrative, of course. According to Irene, who still ran in some of the same social circles, They were telling anyone who would listen that I'd betrayed them, abandoned them in their time of need. "She's saying you're senile," Irene told me over coffee one afternoon, her eyes flashing with indignation. "That you forgot about the arrangement you'd made to cover their mortgage indefinitely." I laughed, a hollow sound even to my own ears. I may be 70, but my memory and my bank statements are perfectly intact. That evening, I sat at my dining room table and spread out the evidence I'd collected over the months. Bank statements showing the mortgage payments coming from my account, credit card bills with Vanessa's unauthorized charges, printed emails where Michael had asked for just a little more help this month while they bought luxury items, and the voicemails, oh, the voicemails. I'd recorded and saved everyone, including the message where Michael had laughed about how they could always count on Mom to bail us out. I organized it all meticulously, the way I'd once organized lesson plans during my teaching days. Then I made copies, multiple copies. One set I sent to Michael's workplace, not to get him fired, but to ensure he couldn't spread lies about me there. Another set went to our family attorney, with instructions to use it if my son ever tried to claim I was incompetent or challenge my will. And the third set, that one I addressed to Vanessa's employer, a local accounting firm where she'd worked as an office manager. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. The unauthorized charges, the pattern of financial exploitation, it would speak for itself. I dropped the package in a mailbox 3 towns over, paid for with cash, no return address. I didn't expect to hear what happened next. I wasn't seeking revenge, just protection, just an end to the lies. A week later, Irene called me. I was in the middle of replanting my herb garden, something I'd neglected during the months of stress and heartache. "They fired her," Irene said without preamble. "Vanessa. They let her go yesterday." My hands stilled in the soil. "What? Why?" "Embezzlement, from what I hear. Apparently, someone sent her employer evidence that she'd been charging personal expenses to other people's accounts. They did an internal audit and found she'd been doing the same thing at work." I sat back on my heels, dirt smudging my gardening pants. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound sense of relief washing over me like a gentle wave. "Now it's over," I whispered, more to myself than to Irene. "Are you okay?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. Was I okay? It was a complicated question. My son had betrayed me. My daughter-in-law had exploited me. I'd lost the future I'd imagined. Sunday brunches with grandchildren, holiday gatherings, the comfort of family as I aged. But I'd gained something too, self-respect, boundaries, freedom from manipulation. "I think I will be," I answered honestly. After we hung up, I stayed in my garden, pressing tiny seeds into the warm earth. Life would continue. Plants would grow, seasons would change. But a question lingered as I worked, as persistent as the chickadees flitting through my yard. What would I do next, now that I was free? For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in being Michael's mother, in being needed, in being useful. Who was I without that role? What did I want for myself, now that I answered to no one but me? I didn't have the answer yet, but for the first time in decades, I had the space to find out. I spent April reassessing my finances. With a sharpened pencil and a fresh notebook, old habits from teaching never quite leave you, I took inventory of what remained after the mortgage disaster. The damage wasn't as bad as I'd feared. I'd lost about 1/3 of my retirement savings, but my pension remained untouched, and Harold's life insurance had been wisely invested years ago. "You're not destitute," I told my reflection in the bathroom mirror one morning. "You're just starting over." The thought should have terrified me at 70. Instead, it felt like slipping into a warm bath after a long, cold day. I called Irene the next afternoon. "I want to move," I said without preamble. "Thank God," she replied. "I've been waiting for you to say that. This house has too many ghosts." She wasn't wrong. Every corner held some memory of raising Michael, of the life I'd built expecting certain promises to be kept. The dining room where we'd celebrated his graduations, the backyard where he'd learned to ride a bike, the kitchen where I'd taught him to make his father's pancake recipe after Harold died. "I'm thinking somewhere smaller," I continued, "somewhere new." Irene, bless her practical heart, didn't waste time with platitudes. "I know a realtor who specializes in properties for people downsizing. Let me call her." 2 weeks later, we were driving along winding roads that hugged the shoreline of Lake Monroe. The April sunshine sparkled on the water, and dogwoods bloomed in patches of white against the greening forest. "It's a bit remote," the realtor warned as we turned down a gravel lane, "but the price reflects that." The cottage appeared around the bend, small white-painted clapboard with blue shutters and a covered porch that faced the water. It wasn't fancy. The roof would need attention in a few years. The kitchen cabinets were outdated, but when I stepped inside and saw the morning light streaming through east-facing windows, something inside me settled. "This is it," I said quietly. Irene squeezed my arm. "You sure? You haven't even seen the bedroom." "I'm sure." I signed the papers 3 weeks later, my hand trembling slightly as I wrote my name, just my name, on the deed. The realtor handed me the keys with a smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Reynolds. It's all yours." All mine. 2 simple words that felt revolutionary after decades of compromise and accommodation. I moved in before summer, hiring a service to pack up the old house and sell what I didn't want to keep. I took my books, my grandmother's china, Harold's old record player, and enough furniture to make the cottage feel lived in without being crowded. The rest, including Michael's childhood bedroom set and the formal dining table where we'd had so many family meals, I let go. "Are you sure you don't want to call him?" Irene asked as we unpacked boxes in my new kitchen. "Let him know you're moving?" I shook my head. "He knows how to reach me if he wants to." My first purchase for the cottage was a copper kettle that whistled like a songbird instead of screaming like a banshee. My second was a rocking chair for the porch, wide-seated and comfortable, with cushions the color of lake water. I placed it facing east, where I could watch the sun rise over the water. In early June, I planted a rose bush beside the front steps, a climbing variety with pale pink blooms that smelled of honey and summer rain. The nursery owner warned me it might not flower until next year, but I didn't mind the wait. I had time now, nothing but time. Each morning I woke with the sun, made tea in my singing kettle, and carried it to my rocker. I watched mist rise off the lake in ghostly tendrils, listened to birds announce their territories, and felt the day warm degree by degree. Some mornings I cried quietly into my tea, mourning the family I thought I'd have. Other mornings I smiled at passing kayakers or waved to the man who fished from the public dock every day at dawn. My phone stayed mostly silent. Irene called regularly. A few old colleagues checked in. My doctor's office confirmed appointments. But Michael's number never appeared on my screen until the day a letter arrived. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the slightly cramped letters, the heavy pressure of the pen. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive-looking. No return address. Just my name and the cottage address, which meant he'd gone to some effort to find me. I held it for a long time, turning it over in my hands, feeling its weight. What would I find inside? An apology? More accusations? A request for money? A demand for explanation? Did it matter? In that moment, sitting in my rocker with the scent of roses drifting up from my garden, I realized it didn't. Whatever words he'd written couldn't change what had happened or who we'd become. They couldn't erase the slap or the theft or the silence that followed. They couldn't restore my trust or rewrite our story. I rose slowly, carried the letter inside, and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, unopened. Not every wound needs picking. Not every question deserves an answer. Not every story needs an ending tied up with a perfect bow. Some stories just need peace. And as I returned to my porch, watching a pair of loons glide across the morning gold surface of the lake, I finally had mine. I fell into a rhythm at the cottage that summer, one that ebbed and flowed with the lake's tides. The days stretched long and golden, giving me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing: time to think. Not just about Michael or the wedding or the foreclosure, but about me, the woman I used to be, the woman I might still become. One afternoon in late July, I found myself sitting at my small kitchen table with a blank journal open before me. Harold had given me journals for years, beautiful leather-bound books that I'd always meant to fill but never did. Too busy with grading papers, raising Michael, keeping our little world spinning. But now I had nothing but hours. I picked up my pen and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then, surprising myself, I wrote, "I miss you, Harold." The words opened something in me. I wrote for hours that day, filling page after page with memories of our early marriage, how we'd met at that faculty mixer where he'd spilled punch on my new dress and then insisted on buying me dinner to make up for it. Our tiny first apartment with the leaky faucet and the window that looked out on a brick wall. The night Michael was born, how Harold had cried harder than the baby, overwhelmed with a love so sudden and complete it had knocked the breath from him. We were supposed to grow old together, I wrote. We had plans, that cabin in Vermont, the cross-country train trip, grandchildren to spoil. You left too soon, my love, way too soon. I closed the journal when my hand began to cramp, surprised to find the afternoon light had softened into evening. My cheeks were wet. I hadn't even noticed I was crying. The next day, I wrote about teaching, 32 years of fourth graders passing through my classroom. The stubborn ones, the brilliant ones, the ones who tested my patience and the ones who broke my heart. I wrote about the retirement party the school had thrown me 5 years ago, how strange it had felt to clean out my desk for the last time. By the end of the week, I'd filled half the journal. Writing became part of my morning ritual: tea, rocking chair, sunrise, then an hour with my memories before the day properly began. "You're looking well," Irene said when she visited in early August. "There's color in your cheeks." "It's the sun," I said, but we both knew it was more than that. I was sleeping better, eating better, breathing easier. The cottage was becoming more than a refuge, it was becoming a mirror, reflecting back a version of myself I barely recognized. A woman with opinions and desires. A woman who had survived betrayal and come out stronger. A woman who could sit alone with her thoughts and not flinch away from what she found there. One Saturday morning, I drove into town for the farmer's market. The little lakeside community came alive on market days, streets lined with stalls selling everything from fresh produce to handmade soaps. I wandered among the vendors, filling my basket with blueberries and tomatoes still warm from the sun. "You must be new here," said a voice at my elbow. I turned to find a woman about my age smiling at me. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and held a bundle of lavender. "I'm Margaret. I live in the blue house on Lakeview Drive." "Evelyn," I said, extending my hand. "I moved into the cottage on Pine Point in June." "The Lawson place. I've always loved that cottage." She handed me a sprig of lavender. "Welcome to the neighborhood." We chatted as we walked between the stalls. Margaret had lived here all her life, she told me. Raised 3 daughters who'd all moved away, lost her husband to cancer 8 years ago. Now she kept busy with her garden and her book club and volunteering at the library. Not once did she ask about my family. Not once did she probe for details about my past or why I'd moved here alone. She just offered conversation, then tea. "I make a lavender shortbread that will change your life," she said. "Come by tomorrow?" "Around 2?" I found myself nodding. I'd like that. That night, I unpacked the last box I'd brought from the old house, the one marked Harold that I'd been avoiding. Inside were his reading glasses, his favorite sweater, and a dozen framed photographs I hadn't been able to look at in months. I unwrapped each one carefully, lingering over the images. Our wedding day, Michael's high school graduation, the trip to Niagara Falls for our 25th anniversary. I selected one, Harold standing on our back porch, arms crossed, grinning at the camera with that crooked smile I'd fallen in love with, and placed it on the mantel above my small fireplace. "We did good," I whispered to his frozen image. "Not perfect, but good." The next morning dawned clear and bright. I was looking forward to tea with Margaret, already planning to bring her a jar of the blackberry jam I'd made last week. I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, ready for my morning ritual, and froze. Michael was sitting on my steps, elbows on his knees, staring out at the lake. He turned when he heard the door open, and for a moment we just looked at each other. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after Harold died. The man who'd stood silent while his wife slapped me across the face. "Mom," he said, rising, "we need to talk." I set my coffee mug on the small table beside me, my fingers suddenly unsteady. My heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. How had he found me? I'd been so careful not to leave a trail. "Michael," I said, my voice sounding far calmer than I felt. He stood there in wrinkled clothes that hung loose on his frame. My son looked thinner, older than when I'd last seen him. The confident swagger was gone. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair needed cutting. A small, traitorous part of me wanted to reach out, to smooth that wayward lock from his forehead, like I had when he was a boy. I kept my hands firmly at my sides. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Irene," he said. "I called her a dozen times before she finally told me." I made a mental note to have a word with Irene about that, but I couldn't blame her entirely. She'd always had a soft spot for Michael. "What do you want?" I asked, though I already knew. "People don't show up unannounced on your doorstep at 7 in the morning unless they need something." Michael ran a hand through his hair, Harold's gesture, the one he'd always made when he was nervous. "Mom, we lost everything." I nodded slowly. "I know." "No, you don't understand," he continued, his voice rising. "The house, the cars, my job, they let me go last month. Said they were downsizing, but I know it was because of the credit mess. He paced the small porch, gesturing wildly. We're staying in this awful motel. Cynthia's parents won't help. They say we made our bed. I didn't respond. What was there to say? They had made their bed. Can we talk? He asked, please. I hesitated, then gestured to the chairs on the porch. I wasn't ready to invite him inside. Not yet. Maybe not ever. We sat facing the lake, the morning sun casting long shadows across the water. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I didn't know, he finally said, staring at his hands. About the charges on your card, the spa days, all of it. I swear, Mom, Cynthia handled the finances. She told me everything was fine. I'd had months to prepare for this conversation, to imagine what he might say. Still, hearing the excuses from his lips made something twist painfully in my chest. You never asked, I said quietly, about the mortgage, about where the money was coming from. I thought, he started, then stopped. I don't know what I thought, that it would all work out somehow. And the wedding, I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. When she slapped me? When you just stood there? Michael flinched. She said you'd insulted her, whispered something cruel when you adjusted her veil. I didn't hear it, but you believed her, I finished for him, without question. He looked away. She was my wife. And I'm your mother, I said, surprised by how steady my voice remained. I raised you alone after your father died. I worked 2 jobs to put you through college. I co-signed that mortgage because you asked me to. I know, he whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. We both are. Cynthia, she's changed. The divorce humbled her. Divorce? This was news. It's almost final, he nodded. After everything fell apart, we couldn't stay together. Too much blame, too many fights. I took a sip of my now cold coffee, letting this information settle. So they'd turned on each other when the money ran out. I wasn't surprised. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking at me with those eyes so like his father's. Mom, I know I have no right to ask this, but I need help, just until I get back on my feet. There it was, the real reason for this visit. Can we come stay with you? He asked, his voice small. Just for a little while. I promise I'll find work, pay you back for everything. I looked at my son, this man I'd loved from the moment I knew he existed, this man who had stood silent while I was humiliated, who had let me be used, who had only come back when he needed something. The answer had formed long before he asked the question. No, I said gently but firmly. You need to stand on your own now. His face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing in an instant. So that's it? After everything I just said, you're just going to abandon me when I need you most? I didn't flinch at his accusation. I'd been expecting it. You abandoned me first, I replied simply. You just didn't notice. Michael stared at me, waiting for me to relent, to soften as I always had before. When I didn't, he stood abruptly. Fine, he said, voice tight with anger. I guess I know where I stand now. He walked down the steps without another word, and I didn't call him back. I watched as he got into a car I didn't recognize, borrowed or rented, I supposed, and drove away, gravel crunching under the tires. I sat there long after he'd gone, watching the ripples on the lake, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Had I done the right thing? The kind thing? I didn't know, but for once I'd done the necessary thing. That evening I sat on my porch again, watching as the sun set in soft pink streaks over the lake. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and water. A loon called somewhere in the distance. I thought about Michael, about where he might be spending the night. I thought about the life I'd built here, this small sanctuary that was entirely mine. I thought about tomorrow's tea with Margaret and the blackberry jam waiting on my counter. When darkness fell, I went inside and closed the door behind me, gently but firmly. A week passed like a gentle stream, quietly, steadily, washing away the sharp edges of Michael's visit. I kept busy with small rituals that had become precious to me. Morning tea on the porch, afternoon walks along the shore, evenings with a book by the fireplace. Margaret had invited me to join her gardening club, and I was considering it. My life was finding its rhythm again. But every time I opened that drawer for a pen or a notepad, I saw it. The unopened letter from my son. It had arrived before he showed up on my doorstep. That much I knew from the postmark. I'd tucked it away, not ready to face whatever words he'd written. After our confrontation, I'd almost forgotten about it. Almost. On a Wednesday morning with rain pattering against my windows, I found myself standing at the drawer, my hand hovering over the handle. Why today? I couldn't say. Perhaps it was the rain, reminiscent of tears. Perhaps it was simply time. This is silly, I murmured to myself. It's just a letter. But we both knew it wasn't just anything when it came to Michael. I pulled the drawer open and lifted out the envelope. It felt lighter than I expected, as if it couldn't possibly contain words heavy enough to matter. The return address was unfamiliar. Not the house I'd helped them buy, of course. That was long gone. I carried it to my favorite chair by the window, where the light was good even on this gray day. For several minutes, I just held it, turning it over in my hands, feeling the slight bump of whatever was inside. And what did I hope to find? An apology? Excuses? More demands? My fingers trembled slightly as I finally slid my letter opener under the flap. The paper gave way with a soft tear, and I reached inside. Not a letter at all, just a photograph. I pulled it out and felt my breath catch. It was from the wedding day, that terrible, wonderful day that had marked the beginning of the end. But this wasn't a photo of the ceremony or the reception. This was earlier, during the preparations. There I was, mid-laugh, my head thrown back slightly, eyes crinkled at the corners. Someone had caught me in a moment of pure joy. I was adjusting something, the flowers perhaps, and someone had said something funny. This was before the slap, before the silence, before I understood what was happening. I looked happy. I looked like a mother bursting with pride on her son's wedding day. I turned the photo over, expecting a note, an explanation, something, but the back was blank. No apology, no words at all, just this image of who we used to be, who I used to be. "Oh, Michael," I whispered, running my finger along the edge of the photo. What was I supposed to make of this? Was it cruelty? A reminder of what I'd lost? Was it regret, a memory of better times? Was it manipulation, a wordless plea designed to soften my heart? I couldn't know, and maybe that was the point. Maybe there wasn't a message. Maybe it was just a photo that he couldn't bear to keep, but couldn't bring himself to throw away. I sat there for a long time, staring at my own frozen smile. It hurt. Of course it hurt, like pressing on a bruise to see if it still ached. But there was something else too, a strange pride. Look at that woman, I thought. Look at what she survived. Look at what she overcame. That woman in the photo didn't know what was coming. She didn't know about the public humiliation, the financial exploitation, the slow erosion of her dignity. She didn't know she would one day have to choose herself over her only child. But she did it anyway. I did it anyway. I slid the photo back into its envelope and carried it to my bedroom. From the closet, I pulled down an old hat box, my memory box, filled with snippets of my life. Harold's wedding ring, a lock of Michael's baby hair, a pressed flower from my mother's funeral, small treasures, painful and precious. I placed the envelope inside, nestled among the other fragments of my past, and returned the box to its shelf. That night, as rain continued to drum against the roof, I dreamed of Harold. We were sitting on a dock, our feet dangling in cool water. He held my hand, his palm warm and familiar against mine. He didn't speak, just sat beside me, watching the lake shimmer in the sunlight. His presence was enough. It had always been enough. When I woke, early morning light was filtering through my curtains. The rain had stopped. I touched my cheek and found it damp, but I was smiling. "Good morning," I whispered to the empty room, to Harold's memory, to myself. I rose and made my way to the kitchen. As I waited for the kettle to boil, I glanced out the window. A robin was hopping across my small lawn, pausing occasionally to cock its head at the ground. New day, new beginnings. I would call Margaret later, I decided. Tell her I'd like to join that gardening club after all. There were seeds to be planted, roots to be nurtured. There was still life to be lived. It's been 6 months since I stood on my porch and told my son no. 6 months of quiet mornings and peaceful nights. 6 months of healing. I woke just after dawn today, the way I do most mornings now. There's something about the early light on the lake that pulls me from sleep, gentle but insistent. I've stopped setting an alarm. My body knows when it's time. The floorboards were cool beneath my bare feet as I padded to the kitchen. I struck a match and lit the lavender candle Margaret had given me last week. "To celebrate your first half year here," she'd said with that warm smile of hers. The flame caught, sending up a thin wisp of fragrant smoke. While the kettle heated, I stood at the window. My garden was coming alive in the morning light. The rose bush I'd planted when I first moved in had taken root beautifully, stubborn and vibrant, just like me. Its first blooms were a deep crimson against the green leaves. Harold would have loved them. He always said red roses had character. "Look at you," I whispered to the roses, standing tall out there. The kettle whistled, pulling me back. I prepared my tea the way I always have, 1 sugar, splash of milk, and carried it to my favorite chair by the window. The wicker creaked comfortingly as I settled in. I set the cup on the small table beside me, next to yesterday's half-finished crossword and the novel Margaret had lent me. Outside, the lake was perfectly calm, a mirror reflecting the blue sky and wispy clouds. A pair of cardinals flitted between the trees at the edge of my property, their morning song soft and sweet. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet sink into my bones. My phone sat on the side table, silent as it had been for weeks now. Michael had tried calling a few times after our confrontation, but I'd let the calls go to voicemail. His messages grew shorter, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. The silence used to feel like an accusation. Now it felt like peace. It no longer bothered me. That realization had come gradually, like the changing of seasons. One day I simply noticed that the sight of my quiet phone didn't send that familiar pang through my chest. I reached for my journal, a simple leather-bound book I'd treated myself to 3 months ago. The pages were filling up slowly, not with regrets or painful memories, but with small joys and quiet observations. The way the light hit the water at sunset, the family of ducks that had made a home near my dock, the recipe for Margaret's blueberry scones that I'd finally mastered. I opened to a fresh page and picked up my pen. June 15th, morning on the lake. I paused, tapping the pen against my chin. What did I want to say today? Not about Michael, not about the past. Those pages had been written, those wounds acknowledged. Today, I wanted to write about something else. I'm thinking about taking that watercolor class at the community center. Margaret says the teacher is wonderful, patient with beginners. I haven't painted since high school, but I remember loving it, the way colors blend and flow. Maybe it's time to try again. The garden club is planning a trip to the botanical gardens next month. I've put my name down. There's a woman there, Elaine, who knows everything about native plants. She's promised to help me choose some wildflowers for the back corner where nothing seems to grow. I've been dreaming about Harold more often lately. Not sad dreams, just him sitting beside me, holding my hand. Sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't. It's comfort, not grief. I paused, sipping my tea. It was the perfect temperature now, warming me from the inside out. Outside, a blue heron landed at the edge of the water, regal and patient. I'm making plans again, I wrote. Small ones, gentle ones, but plans nonetheless. That feels like victory. I closed the journal and set it aside. The lavender candle flickered, casting soft shadows across the table. I wrapped both hands around my teacup, feeling its warmth seep into my fingers. This was my life now, not the one I'd imagined all those years ago when Harold and I first married, not the one I'd pictured when Michael was growing up, but it was mine. Every inch of this cottage, every bloom in the garden, every decision I made, all mine. No one could take it away. No one could use it against me. The peace I felt wasn't loud or triumphant. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. It simply existed, steady and sure, like the foundation of this little house, like the roots of my rose bush, like my own beating heart. I sat there for a long while, framed by the morning sunlight streaming through the window, my teacup warm in my hands, content in this quiet life I'd built for myself, alone but not lonely, separate but whole. Tomorrow would come with its own small joys and challenges. There would be more tea, more birdsong, more pages in my journal. There would be Margaret and the garden club and perhaps new watercolors. There would be memories of Harold and maybe even thoughts of Michael that didn't sting quite so badly. But for now there was just this moment, just me, in my chair watching the lake. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. If you enjoyed this story, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy.